All right, everybody, so here's a quick video to get some extra help with sources for our historical research project. Before we jump into the nuts and bolts of help with sources, let's take a look at the rubric so that we all know exactly what we're going to be graded on. All right, so for sources for this project, for our rubric, it's actually in two different categories, two categories that deal with sourcing. All right, in order to get full points, in order to get an outstanding in both of those sections, you got to do these things. So let's take a look. For this first section, student effectively uses at least 5 sources in their argument. Okay, in order to get full points, you need to do those things. And then the second, right, is student effectively does all of the following for each source. Introduce source by citing its origin, explain the context in which the original source was created, and identify the speaker or creator of the source. This has to do with introducing the source, right, which we'll get into later, right? So if we remember way back in the beginning of the semester, right, we talked about the types of sources and why it's important to know about them, right, before we start our research. So with these sources, it's important to know which each kind is. So if we take a look in the green over here, we have primary sources. So these are sources written at the time of the event by someone with a connection to that specific event. And it's in green here because we know that primary sources are the most valuable types of sources that we could have for our project, right? We're going to make sure that we have those primary sources. Secondary sources are here, and these are written after the event took place by someone who has researched the event and compiled research into a work of history. Now, these are still good, right? These are still good, which is why it's in yellow or orange here. But we want to make sure that all of our research doesn't come only from secondary sources, right? Finally, in the red, we have tertiary sources. These are encyclopedia entries that give general information, combines many different sources into a distilled definition. And these are not great to cite for your project, right? You're going to want to stay away from tertiary sources. These are great for starting research and getting information, but you don't want to cite these, okay? And remember, for this project specifically, right, you got to have 2 primary sources and 5 sources in total. All right, so now there's more specifically, right, the types of sources, right, this is also another important part of it. So we know that primary sources can be a few different things, right? They can be articles, letters, pictures, videos, journal entries, artifacts, etc., right? All of those different things can be considered a primary source, okay? Secondary sources, we're looking at books, academic articles, academic journals, documentaries, museum exhibits, etc., okay? And then tertiary sources, you'll know because there are encyclopedia entries, dictionary entries, Wikipedia, textbooks. Those are tertiary sources, right? Remember, it's important to tell the reader what kind of source it is that you are using, right? So when you go in to talk about a source, you have to mention this is a book, this is a scholarly journal, this is an article from the time period, this is a letter that somebody wrote, or a picture, whatever it may be, right? You have to let the reader know what kind of source it is. It's important for context, okay? So that brings us right here. So introducing our sources. So this is that one portion of the rubric, right, that talks about introducing sources. And essentially what you're doing when you introduce a source is you are giving context, all right? So what is context, right? History is all about context, right? It's important to let the reader know where your source is from and what kind of source it is. So what context does is it helps to paint a clear and more detailed picture of what's happening within your argument, right? So we know that things don't happen in a vacuum, right? We know that there's a lot of different factors that are affecting things at one time, which shapes the outcome of historical events. So it's important to let the reader know what those different things are so they can have a clearer picture of what you're arguing, okay? So when you're introducing a source, things to include, right? And this is what you're going to actually write in your paragraphs, right? You're going to include things like the date, the author, the type of source, who made the source, why is your source relevant, right? These are all things that you can include that give the reader more information so that when they're going in looking at your source, they have a better idea of that source. They have more context, right? So it makes your argument clearer. Here's an example, okay? So we know from my example, I'm writing about indigenous foods. I decided to write about the impact of the potato on the world, right? And I have my source here is this letter, right? So it's a primary source from this woman named Hannah Curtis. She wrote it in 1847. She wrote it to her brother John Curtis about the potato famine, okay, in Ireland. So take a look and see how I introduced this source, right? So I said, in 1847, Irish woman Hannah Curtis wrote a letter to her brother John Curtis. In this letter, she speaks of the struggles and hardships that plagued Ireland as a result of the potato famine. Okay, so I did a lot of things in a very short amount of time, right? So just from this introduction, you know that this letter was written in 1847. You know that it was a letter, so that lets you know it's a primary source. You know that this woman, Hannah Curtis, made it. You know that she's an Irish woman. You know that she wrote it to her brother John. And you know that she wrote about the struggles and hardships of the potato famine, right? This is a lot of really, really valuable information about this source, okay, that the reader needs to know. My reader needs to know, right? So again, right, I'm including the date, I'm including the author, I'm including the type of source, right? I'm implying whether it's a primary or a secondary source. I'm giving information about this source so that the reader can have more context, okay? Here's another one, all right? So in this source, as about the same topic, right? This one is a book by a man named Milton Meltzer, right? So I say, in the book, The Amazing Potato by Milton Meltzer, he states that potatoes were an important staple crop in Inca society. Cool. So this lets the reader know that it's a book, right? So we know it's a secondary source. We have the title of the book, and we have the author of the book, right? This is all important information, right? Because now the reader can say, I wonder what this book is about. Then they type in Milton Meltzer and they find all of his credentials, right? And they find the book, okay? So this is important for giving the reader context, again, all right? So along with sources, I know a lot of us have questions about databases and finding primary sources. I will tell you, right, being a historian myself, finding primary sources is sometimes the hardest part of the historical process. Primary sources are sometimes really hard to find, right? So I will say again, right, using the Leiden database is going to be your best bet. Databases are really good with this kind of stuff, right? So if you remember how to get into there, right, you go to the Leiden website, you go to the library, you go to the databases, right? And I would play around with different keywords and see what you could find, right? Try different combinations of keywords, type in different questions that you might have, and see what pulls up, right? Sometimes you'll find some, sometimes you won't, but that's just the nature of history, of being a historian. Sometimes we can't find primary sources and we have to make things happen without them, right? So maybe go to a different place, right? You could even search it up on Google, right? You just have to be careful with making sure that the source is credible, and then you have to also cite that source as well too. That's what the nice thing about databases is that it comes with a citation already. But you could definitely find something outside of the database. You would just have to cite it by hand, which is pretty easy, right? A lot of us, and this is a real way that I use to find sources, right, is using Wikipedia. Now, the deal with Wikipedia is that it's an encyclopedia, right? It's a tertiary source, so we don't want to cite it. However, if you've gone to Wikipedia, right, and you see that in all of the paragraphs, there's tiny little blue numbers, right? Those are footnotes, okay? And if you click on that little number, it'll take you to where that source, where the information is actually from. And a lot of times, those are primary sources, right? So if you click on that little blue link, right, it's going to take you to the bottom of the page, and it's going to have the link to where whoever wrote that paragraph got the information from. That is a way that I find a lot of sources as well too, because then you just follow the trail, right? Then you go to that source, right? And then once you're in that source, then you can figure out, okay, where did whoever wrote this source, where did they get their information from, right? And you're backtracking. So you can find sources that way, okay? And then for your bibliography, right, you want to make sure it's in MLA or Chicago style, all right? And then your bibliography, the only thing you have to remember, right, is that it should be a separate page at the end of your essay, right? So make sure it's on its own, and then make sure that it's in alphabetical order, right, from top to bottom, okay? Now, if you're using the databases, the citations are already built in. However, if you're using something outside of a database, you're going to have to do your own citations, right? So you could use an EasyBib, you could use a program like that that's going to do it, right? But if you want to double check it, I would use Purdue OWL. The link is in the assignment attached to this document. And just double check and make sure that they're all good, okay? But yeah, that's some help with sources.